particularly the younger crowd that were born after abortion was legalized. They said, it's been legal my whole life, and I just never gave it a thought as to how it became legal. So this has been really educational for me. And, older women have said, oh, I remember this so clearly and, what that fight was like. So it's been wonderful to hear from readers of all ages in terms of how that education through fiction has impacted them.
Much has been written in journals, papers, and books by a significant group of academics and authors about feminism and the equality movement. And there's a growing inventory of productions about women in Canadian life. We want to add more. The Women's History Project is a nonprofit organization launched in 2022. Our ambition is to promote and showcase women in Canadian history. We want trailblazers, leaders, authors, and historians to tell stories about women in the labor movement, at work, in the media, women who took to the streets, equal pay, maternity benefit, the right to have your own bank account. We want to get women who are still living to recount their challenges and campaign. History is rich with stories about advocates, activists, and women in public life at the community, provincial, and national levels, across Canada, in small towns, on farms, in urban areas, women who have used their voice to make a difference. This is 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories. Heather Marshall, storyteller, author, communications professional, feminist. Heather has a master's degree in history and politics and worked in politics and communications before turning her attention to storytelling, her true passion. Her debut novel, Looking for Jane, was an instant #1 bestseller and dominated the Toronto Star and Globe and Mail bestseller charts for 27 weeks over the course of 2022 and 2023, including 5 consecutive weeks at #1. Heather weaves 3 stories about the devastating consequences from a lack of choice. The stories of 3 women in 1971, 1980, and 2017. Based in history, Heather eloquently tells a story about reproductive injustice, underground abortion networks, post-war maternity homes, and forced adoption. It has been published in 14 languages in 19 territories and was recently optioned for development into a television series by Bent Frame Film and TV and Cineflex Studios. Heather's next novel, The Secret History of Audrey James, again a Globe and Mail bestseller, hit the shelves in 2024. This early episode, recorded in 2022, highlights the value of fiction based in history and Heather's influences.
For me, Looking for Jane is personal, with an older sister who was born out of wedlock in 1947 and a mother who fought for her return after having to leave her in a foster home. To my own pregnancy at 16, when abortion committees at hospitals limited the number of procedures a day and under very limited conditions that were not transparent at all. Choices in 1971 were few, and if I didn't have very understanding, loving parents, the outcome may have been different. This story, based in history, provides important real historical context, may open and resolve old wounds and anxiety, and makes history relevant today. It broadened my own understanding of my past. Okay, thank you very much, Heather. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Why Looking for Jane? What made you interested in this topic at all? Because these are not issues that are easy to deal with.
So the root of Looking for Jane, it actually traces back years. When I was doing my history master's degree at the University of Waterloo, I was in a human rights history course that was phenomenal. And I was doing a paper on Henry Morgenthaler's provincial court battles in the years leading up to the 88 Supreme Court decision. And as I was doing the research, down in the bowels of the library, going through all the microfiche, I thought, this would make a great novel. This is so dramatic and compelling. And I can, see these women, these people that were in this fight. And I thought that's just something I would really like to read. Then years later, just completely randomly, I was researching something else entirely. And I stumbled down this rabbit hole and came across an article from the National Post in 2013 or 2014, around then, that was this expose on the maternity home scandal. It was that number of 300,000 women and girls that were forced or coerced into giving their babies up for adoption over that 30-year period. it hit me so hard. And I thought, I'm a feminist. I'm a student of history. I'm the type of person that should have come across this information years ago, and I didn't. So what are the odds that I'll say sort of more the average Canadian who, maybe isn't a feminist or didn't study history knows about this piece of our history? And I had a look to see if anyone had really written about this from the angle I was looking at, and it hadn't been done. So I had these ideas for 2 novels in my head, and I was trying to get them each to work and was sort of struggling to make the plot work in each of them. And then one day, I like to tell this story. I was laying in the bath, which is where a lot of my good ideas come to me. I think it's just the sensory deprivation. I don't have my phone. There's no distractions, just kind of floating around in the water thinking. And it occurred to me that it just sort of clicked that these were actually just 2 threads of the same theme, the same story, which is women having agency over their bodies and over their lives. So when that clicked, I literally screamed for my husband to bring me my notebook. I still have this waterlogged notebook where I was making all of these notes because it dropped into my head almost fully formed. And I started writing it from there. But, yeah, there were times where people said, "Oh, wow, you're writing a book about abortion." And it is and it isn't. But it was something that, both of these topics with women's reproductive rights and the maternity home system, they've previously been topics that are whispered about and haven't been spoken about openly. So that was how Jane came to be. I spent about a year researching and writing, and the research was very emotional. And I sent it off to some agents, and it got picked up within 48 hours. Multiple agents were interested. And then Simon & Schuster Canada picked it up almost immediately for publication. So they also thought this is a story that needs to be told. And it did resonate with people. So yeah, I'm glad those conversations are happening.
One of the things that our Women's History Project does is try to identify some of those issues, because a lot of people will not know the backstory. They will know about the not so great access to abortion services in Canada, because there's still problems with access. They'll know about it. They'll have maybe heard about Morgan Tyler, but they really don't know when or how, or there's not the context. So the novel is a really interesting way to put it all in perspective, I think. So I was overwhelmed by the book, and I know other people have been too. I'm interested in hearing about some of the background search that you talk about. You would have talked to women about this. You've talked to Judy Rebick, for instance. You acknowledge her in the credits. Tell us a little bit about some of those stories and how you really delved down in the women that you talked to get that really solid history foundation.
So one of the difficulties with writing a book about things that people usually only whisper about is trying to find people willing to talk. So interviews were key to get women's experiences, to really bring that to life on the page. So I tried actually first to reach out to an organization called Origins Canada, which was established by a woman who was herself a maternity home survivor. And she's a lobbyist now trying to get the apology from the federal government. And my email slipped through the cracks back when I was doing my research. So we never connected, and I had trouble finding women who were willing to talk about their experiences. So I had to turn to secondary resources. And there was one Canadian book and one from the American perspective, and a few from Irish and English perspectives about the maternity homes. And I was surprised to see how remarkably similar the experiences were, regardless of where you lived. It was just the culture of the time period across the board. These women had some pretty horrendous experiences. So these were firsthand accounts that other researchers had been able to compile. And that research was really, really intense. There were a couple times where I had to sort of step back from it and take a bit of an emotional breather. And when it came to motherhood and childbirth and pregnancy and reproductive justice, I wasn't a mom yet. I had never experienced a pregnancy yet when I was doing this research. So talked to people I knew, asked people who had had abortions if they were willing to speak to me about that. And many people did, and were very, very open about their reasoning and how they felt afterwards. to some extent, I felt more like I was just channeling other women's stories. I wasn't creating it all that much. So I think it feels very real, at times uncomfortably so, I think. But I think that's one thing that readers really see, is that these are representations of very real women that existed and went through these things.
It's interesting because I have heard before about the Irish experience. But I hadn't,
laundries.
but I hadn't heard that this was a problem in Canada. Though in my own life, my older sister was born out of wedlock, and my mother had put her in a foster home and then had problems getting her out of the foster home when my mother was in a position. And this was like 1947. So something similar. She had to go to court, and it took a lot of money and a lot of time to get her daughter back, because it was a foster. So it wasn't quite the same, but it was the same kind of era and the same kind of, it was, so you hear about the Irish experience, but you don't hear about the Canadian experience. So well done on you for that. Did you ever meet with and talk to Judy Rebick about the Morgan Tyler?
So one of my first feminist texts was 10,000 Roses, which my mom gave to me in my late teens sometime. So I still had all these documents. Again, it was felt a little bit like Kismet in some ways. When I started doing the research, I thought, I'm going to delve into that. And so I knew she was someone that I wanted to talk to, because I thought I want to get a perspective of the boots on the ground. And she was so instrumental and close to Morgan Tyler. So I emailed Judy at the ramble.ca address that I could find and said, "Hi, I'm a nobody. I'm writing this book. Would you have a conversation with me?" And she said, "Yep, come on up." I was actually going to be in Toronto. I did the Humber School for Writers workshop in July of, I guess that was 2019. And so I said, "Perfect. I'm going to be in Toronto." So we met. She invited me over to her apartment. We had a drink, and I just chatted with her for 2 or 3 hours. And I just said, "Can you give me a sense of, what it felt like? How did you get involved, sort of start to finish? Anything, do you feel is left unresolved? What were the hiccups? What were the glitches? What were the challenges?" And we had a really, really great exchange. I've been in touch with her since, as when the book got picked up for publication and everything. I think she was quite tickled that it had been. So that was a wonderful conversation. I'm so grateful that I got that perspective from her. I wasn't able to connect with anyone. I think it might be a little bit different now if I tried. My name's out there a little bit more, but I did get Judy's perspective on that, and she sort of shared some of their stories in addition to what was already in 10,000 Roses. And there were some things, interviews even on the CBC archives. There was lots of resource material for me to delve into and kind of pull from.
In fact, when we did our event around sexual health and reproductive justice, she actually attended as one of the as a guest. She wasn't one of the presenters. She's still interested and active in the topic. The abortion caravan and Karen Wells. Did you talk to Karen, or did you talk to any of the women who went on the abortion caravan?
The scene with the abortion caravan and the protest in Ottawa, I had to fight to keep that one in, because the book was a bit long. There was a lot that hit the cutting room floor, and I felt really, really strongly that I wanted to keep that in there. It's action, it's exciting, but I thought I'd really like people to know this, because so few people do. And that's another thing I've heard from women of all ages who read the book, but particularly the younger crowd that were born after abortion was legalized. They said, "It's been legal my whole life, and I just never gave it a thought as to how it became legal. So this has been really educational for me." And, older women have said, "Oh, I remember this so clearly, and, what that fight was like." So it's been wonderful to hear from readers of all ages in terms of how that education through fiction has impacted them.
It's the one thing that I want to do, is to be able to capture the voices of people. Our series is called 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories, and put it in context, because a lot of the younger people would not know how we got here. And then people like me go, "Oh, I forgot about that. I remember that. Oh, I forgot about that. Oh, I forgot about this." So the whole idea is to do different kinds of events or podcasts where we can actually explore some of those things and just remind people what it was like, and to actually honor the women that helped pave the way for us, because I think that is also really important. On to the next topic. You mentioned only very briefly about adoption and racialized women and the 1960s Indigenous scoop. You mentioned that all in the epilogue on author's notes. But today, intersectionality is so important. You can't have a conversation about feminism without talking about intersectionality. Did you come across any of that in terms of either your research or your ideas for writing the story? Racialized or lower income women. I know you have one of your characters is, lesbian. So, I mean, that's a little bit of that intersectionality, but talk a little bit more about that.
Say the intersectionality of feminism is far more prevalent and I would say necessary, but for the time period that I was writing in, not so much. Valerie Andrews, the researcher that compiled the numbers, she's the director of Origins Canada, which I was mentioning before. And in her research, she says, this was an inherently racist system because white babies were commodities, for one thing. And as I say, there was an understanding that babies of color were not wanted or were unadoptable. So, no one benefited from this system. And I mean, I was taking a snapshot in history, right? So I was looking at the maternity homes, where, middle class and upper class white women went. There were almost no references to women of color. And in terms of the reproductive justice storyline, that was always a sticky one because, again, the intersectionality wasn't there in the second wave during those years. There was some interesting things that I came across when I was researching the Chicago Jane Network, the Jane Collective, and they did have internal strife where Black women were saying, we need more representation in the collective if we're going to speak to Black women who need our services. And that was a bit of a wake-up call for them as well. I didn't see as much of that in the Canadian context, but again, it was so difficult to research because those records just weren't kept. I did include the character of Alice, who is one of my favorite characters in the book. She's obviously a Black woman. And it was, difficult as a white writer. There was a lot that I would have really liked to include, from the Black perspective for women of color, how they were impacted, whether they had access to these services, how the Jane Network a fictional Jane Network responded to that. And, first of all, there wasn't a whole lot of room. As I say, I'm very wordy and my editors pare things down. But also that wasn't really my story to tell. So the book has been optioned for TV and, I can't say too much, but it's my understanding that they have been working with consultants, and they would really like to expand the character of Alice. And I'm so thrilled that they're going to do that and maybe look a bit more into that intersectionality, the communication that they had with the American Jane Network and how race played into that. So that's, as I say, wasn't really my story to tell, but if they're able to bring that more to life on the screen and expand what I've got on the page, that's thrilling to me.
Okay, so creating the backstory for 3 intertwining stories. Which character came first, and which one do you like the most?
I think the character of Evelyn came first, and I always waffle when I'm considering whether she or Nancy are sort of the linchpin of the story. And I thought, I'm going to have this woman who was in a maternity home, and that's her motivation for what she does as an abortion provider. It's to give other women the choice that she never had. And that was a very powerful motivation for that character. And so she kind of, came to life first. I thought there is going to be another character that's, her lost daughter, and there's going to be a reunion. And then I also wanted to show, as a reader and a reader of historical fiction, I love interwoven points of view. I find it, as a writer, just gives me an opportunity really to tell more than one story. So that's creatively very interesting. And with Looking for Jane, I didn't want to, as I say, just show I wanted to show an evolution of how far we've come with reproductive justice from the 60s through to almost the present day. And then really, again, kind of showing how far we still have to go in many ways. But to do that, I needed to have a present day character, and I needed to have multiple perspectives in different timelines to really pull those threads through. and show how things are so different from Evelyn in the 1960s to Angela in 2017. Drastically different. So that was why I chose that structure. And as I say, as a reader, I always enjoy it. And as a writer, it gives me the most, best creative legs, I suppose, to really dig down into the themes.
This book has an excellent resource section for book clubs. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about why you did that, and for further readings. But you also have you've also created a call for action. So talk a little bit about the post story and the resources and the book clubs.
The book clubs thing is actually something that the publisher spearheaded. So that's something they like to include for books that are pretty clearly going to be book club material, where there's, some relevant themes, emotional themes that people are going to want to talk about. So they compiled some of the questions and I added in a few of my own. And, I don't think there's any shortage of things to talk about, with this book, but I did want to give readers a little bit of guidance. And there was a couple of things I included as well, like, whether readers picked up on it or not, but sort of time as this slippery thing as a theme. And so I added in a couple of questions about that and how things like time, are treated in the novel. But I always just think it's wonderful that people are even choosing it for book clubs. It's a thrill to me that people are having these conversations to begin with. So I'm certainly more than happy to give some guiding questions. And the timeline, I don't know if you've visited my website. There's a click through for the timeline. And that actually gives a breakdown of what was happening in my novel and what was happening in history in certain periods. So we could see, here's what Nancy is doing in this era, and here's what the law was, and here's what people were up to. So that's another kind of little added feature if you want to have a look at that. But I thought, people who consume historical fiction, and it kind of touches on a lot of things that I've already talked about, but people who consume historical fiction and people who write it, usually you read it because you're looking to be educated in some way in an accessible, entertaining manner. So, as authors, we have to choose how close we're going to stick to the historical record. And I generally like to stick pretty close, or at least I definitely wanted to with Looking for Jane. But I do also like to provide information on, here's what I made up. Here's what I didn't. Here's where you can go find more information. And it's been really exciting to hear from readers saying, I loved this fictional account and that caused me to go Google it and learn more about it. And now I'm more educated than I was before. Like, as I say, if people are having these conversations and are being a little bit more educated by it, that's the best thing I could have asked for as an author. I'm really pretty excited about that.
Read a friend's book. It was a nonfiction book. It was, about the women's equality movement. Lorna Marsden, she became the president of York University. I read her book a couple of summers ago. Her book was so good on history, and I was highlighting everything, and her footnotes were so good. I ended up buying probably about 10 or 12 other books that she had referred to just because the history was so good. And she made reference to this time in history, and this is the book, and this is her source. I went and I ended up in an 18-month period buying 65 books on feminism. I've not read them all, but I've bought them. So the idea of providing some resources or background information so people can do the research and be self-educated, I think is really important. And that's the kind of thing that we're doing. Talk to me a little bit about your call for action. 300,000 women.
With 300,000 girls impacted by the maternity home system, that means that there were also 300,000 babies that were also impacted. So 300,000 women and girls, and again, that's likely a conservative estimate. It might be closer to 4, were forced or coerced into giving their babies up for adoption during the maternity home mandate during about a 30-year period. And as I've said, that number, that's a small city. When you really sort of put it in perspective, and that number just shocked me enough that I knew I wanted to write the book, but I also knew if I was going to write this, I needed to try to go a little bit further, and ask something of my readers after they'd stopped reading. And I've been, very open about having an agenda with this book. And that agenda is to help try to secure the government apology, for these women. So I've been working quite closely with Valerie Andrews and Origins Canada, who were the lobbyists trying to get the apology. They were the people that were finally able to secure the Senate committee report, which said, yes, this happened. And yes, we are culpable. Here's what we think the government should do. And one of those things was issue a formal apology in the House of Commons. So that was years ago now. They gave the government 1 year in which to do that, and there's been no action. So there is actually a little bit more momentum now. I've been working closely with them. I've been pestering MPs. As I say, I do still have my foot in the door a little bit in terms of politics. So I've been reaching out to every contact that I can and saying, this really needs to happen, and time is running out. These women are aging. Many of them who were in the maternity home system in the 40s may very well have passed at this point. And this is something that really needs to happen. So I asked readers, if you were moved by the story, again, they are very real stories. These came from real women. And I feel that it's the least we can do as a country to issue this formal apology. It costs nothing, but we need enough squeaky wheels, to help push that through. And one thing in talking with Valerie Andrews that really, should have been obvious to me, but something about the way she phrased it just really hit home is she said, we were told to go home and never talk about this again. And so many of those women didn't even tell their spouses, didn't tell their children. A lot of people found out these things once they started doing, 23andMe, the genealogy, DNA. There's some surprises in family trees. And some women, really only as they were getting close to death, finally were able to admit it and talk about it. So she said the silence and the gaslighting and the way we were conditioned to not talk about it. She said, we're asking women who have maybe never even told their spouses to come down to Parliament Hill and advocate for themselves and lobby for an apology. So the number of women out of that 300 and plus thousand that are willing to do that is a minuscule percentage. Tiniest percentage of the women that were impacted are actually visible in the lobby. So I've been asking readers to fill their places, to use their voices where these women can't, and email, call your MP, make noise, demand that this happen. We are getting more and more support from MPs. We're hoping to set up a meeting with the Women's Caucus for a bit more of a united front. We're so close to getting this apology. And as I say, it's just the bare minimum that the government can do to help bring some measure of justice to these women.
You've talked about the 300,000 women, but that means there was 300,000 babies. Did you ever, and you touch on this with Nancy Nancy, because I don't want to give everything away either. But with Nancy, did you talk to some of the babies?
I have heard from children, and it's been, as I say again, quite humbling, hearing from a couple who've said, I never wanted to try to find my birth mother, but after reading your book now, I want to. Where do I start my search? I'm not really an authority on this, but as I say, I've just sort of been bowled over by the response and what the book has done, the conversations that it started, in terms of opening up, a little bit, because there's just so much secrecy and shame and stigma. So I think it's a whole different experience for the children. And that's another thing too, is, as you say, 300,000 women, then that's 300,000 Canadians. And now, they've gone on to have families of their own. And how many people are descended from one of these maternity home survivors? It's actually a lot. There's a lot of this. When you start talking to people about their family trees, you'll find this with some frequency. So again, as I say, I think I didn't even expect that it would touch people on the level that it has, or with the scope that it has. Maybe I think I thought that this book was targeted a bit more for, feminist readers between 30 and 60. And I've heard from men who said, yep, I was one of these babies, and only found out later in life and connected with my mom. People that I never thought would read the book, have read the book. And it seems to just be, a dark Canadian experience, the one that a lot of people apparently share. And that was what I heard from adoptees, especially the people that weren't told about it. They said, I just always felt that something was off. Some kind of intuition, I suppose. I mean, I've never experienced that. I can't explain that, but it's certainly a common account. Even, people that were adopted into completely loving families, love their adoptive parents. Just again, as I say, I always felt that something was a little bit out of step and weren't entirely shocked to learn it. What I wanted to demonstrate with Nancy was the shock came more with the betrayal, not with the fact that it was true.
Anything else you want to raise or comment or tell us about the next book? Because I understand you're writing still or writing again.
I actually just submitted the revisions to, the next draft of my next book, which should hit shelves around this time next spring sometime. I never thought I would write a World War II novel. I stumbled across a reference to a Canadian war heroine named Mona Parsons. And to the best of anyone's knowledge, she's the only Canadian civilian woman to have been sentenced to death and imprisoned by the Nazis during World War II. She and her husband were in the Netherlands, and they were helping downed Allied airmen get to safety. And she was imprisoned, ended up escaping prison during when an Allied bombing air raid, made her way back on foot to the Netherlands, where she was recovered by a Canadian regiment that had just liberated the Netherlands. And her story, I thought, this just writes itself. And she was such a brave, compelling character. She was an actress, and so her acting skills sort of helped her get by in certain moments. So I've deviated from her life story in some places and picked it up in others, and I'll talk about her a lot in the author's note, but my main character is heavily influenced by the life of Mona Parsons. So it takes place in Berlin in kind of just before the outbreak of the war and into the war, and up on near the Scottish border in the north of England around the present day. So rather dark and moody up there. And so it's double timelines and, some, again, fairly heavy themes. But I hope people will enjoy it. It's the pressure is awful. So, oh my gosh, just, because of the reception to Looking for Jane, I just thought, I hope people know I can never recreate that magic. But I'll certainly try to make new magic, I suppose.
I look forward to it. First of all, I like interesting Canadian women. That's what we do at our Women's History Project. And my daughter lives in Scotland. I just want to wrap this up. If you could just do your readings, and I think we can conclude it. I think that would be great.
Cool. This excerpt is from Maggie's chapter, which again, almost got cut, and I had to fight to keep this included. And I'm so glad we did, because I've, for a long time, felt like it's some of my best writing. And this was actually the excerpt that got me into the Humber School for Writers. So it has some meaning for me. Maggie closes the bathroom door behind her. Her sister-in-law has draped an assortment of fussy lace doilies over the back of the toilet tank. Several pots of face and hand creams are clustered together on the counter beside the sink. Rolls of fluffy pink hand towels are folded with unnatural neatness on the shelf above the toilet. Maggie turns the brass key in the lock and hears it slide into place with a satisfying click. She doesn't want to be disturbed. For months now, she's not had a moment alone. She craves peace and quiet and solitude and an end to the chaos. Her brother told her to go take a bath, then have a nap, and that they would talk once she had rested a while. She grips her hands on the edge of the counter now, bracing her weak body as she observes herself in the mirror. The girls were not allowed a mirror at the home, but it's only now that Maggie truly wonders why they were denied one. She can barely stand to look at her reflection, meet her own eyes, heavy with an indescribable exhaustion she fears she won't ever recover from. Her complexion is pallid, her features sunken and waxy. Her cheekbones are sharper than she's ever seen them. Maggie glances down at the stack of chatelaine magazines in the rack beside the toilet. A fresh young brunette graces the cover with penciled brows, red lips, and full rouged cheeks. Pretty and clean and new. She'll teach you how to make the perfect bundt cake for Sunday tea and settle a fussy child. How to clean your husband's shirts to pure white perfection, starched and ironed and ready for him each morning. Maggie wonders if the smiling cover girl can also offer lessons on how to scrub away the sweat and blood of the past, the incriminating stains of transgressions and bad fortune.
lipstick from your husband's collar in a shade you don't own.
Excellent. I want to thank you very, very much for this. I thought that was just fabulous. Anyway, good discussion.
Thank you, Clifford.
I think this is.
I'm Debra Davis, president and co-founder of the Women's History Project. This has been the Women's History Project production, with thanks to our sponsors, partners, and special guests. Please like us, follow us, subscribe, and share. You can find out more about our first season of 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories on our website, www.womenshistoryproject.ca.